Hello and welcome to the Hometown Church Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jesse Roskamp. I am your host, and today I am joined by Brent Knox.
Yes.
Brent Knox, how are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Thanks for being here. And thank you guys for being here and tuning in today. Today we are continuing our Worship, Proclaim, Baptize series. Just a few weeks ago, we unveiled our new 3-year church vision, which is Worship, Proclaim, Baptize, just 3 simple words. And what our church vision is all about is how we plan to go about accomplishing our church mission, which is to make healthy disciples who passionately love Jesus and authentically love people. And so we believe that is kind of the church-wide, global church, capital C church mission. That's what Jesus gave us to do, and that's what we're trying to do. But how we do that can look different from church to church, right? And so as our pastors got together, they sat down and they kind of came up with these 3 words as kind of directive as a church for how we're going to go about doing this. And so on Sundays, we've been having a sermon series where we have been kind of unpacking this. What does it look like? Why, how to go about doing these things. And here on the podcast, we're doing something a little bit differently. We're taking a look at those 3 words, and we're taking a look at how they are used between the Old and the New Testament. So the first 2 weeks of this series, we took a look at worship and how worship was done in the Old Testament, how it was done in the New Testament, what changed, why it changed, and how we're supposed to do that in our daily lives as Christians, how we're supposed to live out a life of worship that goes beyond just singing. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the second word. And this has probably been the most difficult of the 3 to come up with a direction for what we're doing in the Old and New Testament.
That's your fault, not mine.
That is kind of my fault. But I think this is actually really interesting because the direction that we're going is we're talking about how the gospel gets proclaimed in the Old Testament. And then we'll be taking a look at that as well in the New Testament for next week. But I think this is really interesting, and it's one that I think is interesting because I was talking to my mom about this. She's like, well, what are you talking about in the Old Testament? I'm like, well, we're talking about how the gospel gets proclaimed in the Old Testament. And she's like, what? The gospel's the New Testament.
Right,
So,
right. Well, that's a common misconception.
Yeah, but really, we're looking at the Bible as one big unified story, and so that's really where we're going to be kind of focused in on today is how the gospel is actually not just like it's foreshadowed, but also proclaimed in kind of this cool progressive revelation style that we'll take a look at today throughout the entire story. But I wanted to start, and maybe you can kick us off here by just giving us kind of an overall introduction to what we mean when we say proclaim.
Yeah, and I'm just going to start off with a verse. I just would happen to be here in this psalm in my quiet time here this morning, and it's Psalm 71, and it's the psalm that David evidently wrote in his old age. So, I'm resonating with that part. And he says in verse 15, he says this, I will tell everyone about your righteousness. And I think it's interesting. He says, I will tell everybody about your righteousness, Lord. He's not telling people about David's own righteousness, but he's telling everybody about your righteousness, O Lord. All day long I will proclaim, and there's our word, I'll proclaim your saving power, though I'm not skilled with words. I'll praise your mighty deeds, O sovereign Lord. I will tell everyone that you alone are just. And we'll get to this, but the essential gospel message is proclaiming God's saving power. And David says that right there, and that's what's driving him on, even in his old age, is all day long I'll proclaim your saving power. And we have the opportunity to be brought right into that privilege of proclaiming God's saving power. It's not proclaiming our own power, but we're proclaiming God's power. And right there, that's a critical distinction, right? The idea of proclaim is this is about God. It's a message that we speak. And there's a story to tell, a true story about how God saves. And we're not proclaiming necessarily how to live. We're proclaiming God's saving power. And you might think, well, what's the difference? What's the big deal about that? Well, in the late 1800s, modernism started to influence Christianity, and Christian thinkers began to move away from the miracles of the Bible. They began to emphasize the lifestyle of the Bible, but not the miracles. And in other words, they began to say things like, well, it's not so important. The miracles aren't so important in the Bible. What's important is what Jesus taught. And he taught us to love our neighbors, but it's not important that he really went to the cross or that he rose from the dead. Besides, miracles are not scientific. How can you believe them in any way? And it makes you look naive if you believe in miracles. And besides that, proclaiming miracles divides people. That was the whole beginning of liberal theology. And of course, we, as Bible believers and believers in Christ, we take the Bible literally, and we know that miracles are central to the Bible. And it's more than that. Miracles are central to the gospel and how we got saved. I mean, if there was no substitutionary death on the cross, if there was no resurrection, then there's no gospel. Then there's no salvation. So we proclaim a message. And I hope you understand why I'm making that distinction. It's a message. We're proclaiming. It's that word proclaim was a fairly common word used back in the first century. It was used of a herald or a town crier that a king would send out to proclaim a message to people, and is usually a message of victory. And in the same sense, our message that we proclaim is a message of victory. That's what gospel means. It means good news. It's a message of victory. That's why it's so tied into the word evangelism, because that's what evangelism in the Greek means, good news. We are proclaimers of good news, and it's good news about God, and it's not good news about us. And that's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was one of the things that really stood out to me and struck me, was that this idea of evangelism was not a new idea for church people. It wasn't like a churchy religious term. It was very much a more of like a political statement, almost, of like announcing a kingdom and announcing a king. And when we think about like evangelism in the gospel, that's not really what we think of, but that at its core is what it is. We are announcing the king who saves, the king who comes and who is full of justice and mercy, full of grace and truth, right? And we are proclaiming this person. When we look at the gospel, right, the gospel that is being proclaimed, and like the stories, the 4 books that we call the gospels, it is the life centered around the person of Jesus, right? And who this person is. He is that king that we are proclaiming, and he is that king who comes to save us. And so it's goes beyond just personal salvation, which I think a lot of times we can reduce the gospel down to, but that is still at the core of what the gospel is.
Right, and a large part of it, maybe I should say wholly, revolves around the resurrection. Paul said this in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, and if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching, or proclamation is the Greek word there where we get that word, our proclamation is in vain, and your faith is in vain if Christ wasn't raised from the dead. And that supernatural act of God in history authenticates the words and the works of Jesus. And if Jesus had not risen from the dead, then this whole gospel thing just becomes a ethical teaching by some fine guy in history. But it's way more than that. It's the saving power of God, and authenticated by his resurrection. And so the resurrection is a big deal here, and it is good news to those who believe. There's another verse that I really like where we talk about the gospel here, and it's the gospel. This message is the power of God. We proclaim this message, people's lives get changed.
Mm-hmm.
It's the power of God. So he says here, 1 Corinthians, the message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction. But we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. As the scriptures say, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and discard the intelligent of the intelligence. So this foolish message that scholars dismiss, the simple message that is the saving power of God expressed through Jesus Christ, is the very power of God. We've got a powerful message. That's where God's power is being demonstrated. Wow, this is a big deal. And it's not a self-improvement message. I was looking on Amazon the other day. Well, I think it was just this morning. How many self-help books do you think that are on Amazon in the book section? They think they don't have a direct count, but they think it's around 100,000.
Wow.
With 15,000 new self-help books hitting the market every year. There's a lot of attraction about trying to improve ourselves, and it's thinking there's something that we can do. The gospel is just the opposite of that. There's nothing we can do. It's all about what God can do to save us, not about what we can do to improve ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And ultimately that is the thing that distinguishes Christianity from every other worldview.
That's right.
Is that there is actually nothing we can do to improve ourselves. It has to come from outside of ourselves. And so that's bad news if you want to do it yourself. But it's pretty good news if you realize that you can't.
Oh, amen. And so it boils down, we proclaim a message. That message is a powerful message. That message saves. And it's not about us. It's all about God's saving power.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's transition here and kind of start to look specifically into the Old Testament. But before we specifically look at how different examples of how the Old Testament is revealing that gospel throughout the story, let's maybe start by just taking a broad look at how the Old Testament as a whole proclaims the gospel.
Yeah, and I think there's some important New Testament verses that we ought to mention here that ties in the gospel to the Old Testament, because a lot of Christians think, well, the Old Testament, that was a whole nother ball game. That was like, oh, you have to obey all these commandments. And some Christians erroneously think, well, that's really was works-based, but I'm glad we live in the era of grace now. And they're having trouble even seeing how the Old Testament is even relevant. Well, it's extremely relevant. The gospel was proclaimed in the Old Testament. The gospel sets the stage for the New Testament. The gospel is the seeds of the gospel for the New Testament. And there's some really important verses that tie this together, like Romans 1:2. It says this: God promised this good news, gospel, that's what it is, promised this gospel long ago through his prophets in his holy scriptures. And in Galatians says this: what's more, the scriptures looked forward to this time when God would make the Gentiles right in his sight because of their faith. God proclaimed this good news, gospel. God proclaimed the gospel to Abraham long ago when he said, all nations will be blessed through you. So the gospel is being proclaimed in the Old Testament. Jesus said this, he said in John, you search the scriptures because you think they give you eternal life, but the scriptures point to me. So all the Old Testament scriptures is pointing to Jesus. And then on the road to Emmaus, he says to those disciples, he says, then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Jesus is being revealed in the Old Testament. And then this last one I think is really interesting about the prophets. First Peter, he says this salvation was something even the prophets wanted to know more about when they prophesied about this gracious salvation prepared for you. They wondered what time or what situation the Spirit of Christ within them was talking about when he told them in advance about Christ's sufferings and his great glory afterwards. So the prophets, Abraham, Moses, all the portions of the Old Testament are pointing to Jesus and revealing the future about Jesus. That's the gospel was being revealed back then.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so I think that's really important when we try to understand what the Old Testament is in general, and how it relates to the gospel in the New Testament, because really the Old Testament is an essential part of the gospel, and we see this throughout many examples, right? I think of like each of the gospels, each of the gospel accounts, each one of them starts with some sort of reference to the Old Testament. And so if you're reading through these as stories, you kind of get this sense that you're getting thrown into the middle of a river that's already flowing. Like you're not at the start of the story. There's something that's already going on. Like, Gospel of Matthew starts with the genealogy of Jesus. There's this whole line of people, each one whose story is somehow connected to who Jesus is and what he means. Mark, right away, the first thing he says, this is the beginning of the gospel. And then he references Isaiah. And it's like, okay, so there's something going on with Isaiah that's important here. John starts with like a whole retelling of the creation account, but from the perspective of Jesus's role within that. And so all of it is to tell us that there is something that is going on in the Old Testament, and it is a story that is playing out that has not reached its conclusion yet, but is still ongoing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so what that story is, I think when we take a look at it from a wide perspective, is something that's kind of really interesting, right? It's the story of God creating humanity falling into sin, and then God setting a plan of redemption in place, first through a nation, then through a family, David's line, and then ultimately whittling it down until there was just one person who it could be, and that was Jesus. And then we reach the conclusion when we get to the Gospels. But yeah, is anything else there from kind of a broad view that you wanted to touch on?
Well, from the broad view, it seems like that there are three huge themes about the unveiling of the gospel in the Old Testament. Number one, there's a coming Messiah that's predicted, who's going to rule, judge, save. And then there's a coming atonement that will deal with sin once and for all. And then there's a coming kingdom where God dwells with his people in peace. Those are three main themes that start off small in the Old Testament. And then as you start going through those Testament, then that progressive revelation, the picture becomes clearer and clearer, pointing to Jesus more exacting. So it starts really small. So as you mentioned, God created, man fell, but right there at the heels of Adam and Eve sinning in the garden and all of humanity falling with them in that sense, in Genesis 3:15 is the earliest proclamation of the gospel, where God promises that the seed of the woman will crush the serpent.
Yeah.
And that seed is referred generally now as a descendant of the woman, Jesus. He will bruise your heel, but you're going to crush his head. So God promises right from the beginning that the person and the works of the devil will be destroyed.
Yeah. So let's kind of start our conversation of slowly working our way through the Old Testament and seeing how this snowball kind of gathers and grows as we go with this passage, because I think this is one of the most fascinating passages in the entire Bible. It's given a very scholarly specific name. The Proto-Evangelium is what it's called.
Oh, I've heard that one. Yes.
Yeah, it just means the first gospel.
Right.
It's the first time that the gospel gets proclaimed. And I think it's interesting that the first time it's proclaimed, it is by God himself, like speaking. And it's in this weird riddle almost, right? About snakes and seeds and heads and heels being crushed and let's just kind of break it down a little bit. And I think maybe it'd be helpful to read it specifically here. He says, and I'll kind of back it up just a statement before into verse 14. And this is God speaking to the serpent. He says, "So the Lord said to the serpent, because you have done this, you are cursed more than any livestock and more than any wild animal. You will move on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life. I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel.
Very clear.
Very clear. So specific. Let's break it down a little bit. What is he saying here? What's going on?
Well, I don't want to jump to the end of the story too quickly,
Sure.
but bruising the heel means that Satan, in a sense, will bruise and we know later bring death to the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
But when Jesus rose from the dead, he broke the power of the devil and smashed his works and smashed his dominion over man. And so in that sense, by his resurrection, he crushed his head. He will end up eliminating completely, as the rest of the prophetic story goes, which we haven't quite got there yet, but he broke the power of the devil, and he will cast him into the lake of fire to perish for all eternity and restore completely everything that was lost in the garden.
Yeah.
And that is the embryonic promise of all that happening right there in Genesis chapter 3.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note a couple things with this. One is that it's setting up the promise that the defeat of Satan and death and sin is ultimately going to come at the hands of a human. Which
that's a good point. I like that.
Yeah. It ultimately will come from the seed of the woman, and so that's a huge thing. And then there's this strike, this like simultaneous strike that's going to be happening. One is at the heel, so it's not a lethal strike.
Right.
It's going to hurt and it's going to be damaged, but it's not going to be lethal. While the crushing of the head implies something lethal, finite. It's like this is
final. Yes.
this is the ultimate blow that's going to take away all the power. But yeah, so I think it's just it's so strange to me that we see it's also setting up kind of this this rivalry between the seed of the woman and the seed of the snake, and this is going to be a story that plays out through the rest of the gospel. And it's weird because it's like, most of my life when I read this, I'm like, oh yeah, women hate snakes. Scared of snakes.
A little bit more than that.
Yeah, I think there is a lot more going on to that. And I think a passage that really helped me to kind of see what was going on here is John chapter 10. It might be 8 or 10, one of those.
Don't quote me on it, huh?
Yeah, where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. I think it's 8. And he says something to them. He says, "You are of your father, who's the devil." And they're kind of taken aback at this because they're like, what do you mean we're of our father, the devil? And so Jesus is revealing that it's those who have given themselves over to sin who are the offspring of the snake, right? And so I think we have a tendency to read this and be like, oh yeah, those baby snakes, those are the bad guys of the story, not recognizing that it is all of us who have given into the temptation of sin that have become that one and have become the rival to the one who is the true heir of all things, and that's the true human, the true seed of the woman who's going to come and redeem all things, and that we have to be redeemed through him to become truly human again. And that his rivalry, his fight is not against the offspring of the snake, right? He says that there's a rivalry between the offspring of the snake and the offspring of the woman, but his strike is against the snake, not against the offspring. And I think that's important as well.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, so that's kind of the first little seed that we get of this gospel as it kind of goes forward. Maybe take us on to the next part of this.
The next major movement of that would be, if it's going to be a descendant of the seed of a woman, then God has to choose a nation to bring the Messiah through. Who is the Messiah going to be born to? God chooses Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 to be the father of the nation of Israel. And God's plan is to bring the Messiah through the Israelites, through the Jews, because the Messiah had come from somewhere, right? So he chooses the Jews, and then he gives Abraham some incredible promises gospel oriented. This is the gospel that was preached to Abraham, according to Paul, who wrote the book of Galatians. And he says that all nations will be blessed through your seed. And so we get a little bit more knowledge. There's going to be a descendant of Abraham that all the nations will be blessed through. And that's referring to Jesus. As we go through the story of Abraham a little bit more, we have the story of Abraham and Isaac, and we understand that there is going to be a lamb that will substitute. We understand that from the story of Abraham that righteousness comes by faith because Abraham believed and it was accredited to him as righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
He just believed that, and so we learn a lot. We learn that when Abraham steps between the two cut animals, that God is stating that I am going to be the one who is going to pay the price for your failure.
Mm-hmm.
So there is all sorts of gospel proclamations and foreshadowing with the story of Abraham.
Yeah. And this is kind of where the story takes a more I guess specific turn, where Genesis 1 through 11 is very much kind of like a broad view of the totality of humanity, and then setting up like the conflict between God and humanity, and like how is that going to get resolved. And so we get this promise of the woman's the seed of the woman and the snake, and that's kind of the broad view. And then we get a more specific plan through the person of Abraham. And so from there, the rest of the Old Testament is going to tell this story of God in this nation. And so somehow this redemption is going to come through this nation. We don't really know specifically how, but it is through this promise to Abraham that needs to be fulfilled somehow. And so kind of zeroing in on it, I think there's a lot of things from the story of Abraham that we could point to, but we get a lot of different ways that God starts to proclaim and foreshadow the gospel through this story. And I think one of those is directly telling him and giving him these hints of this blessing that's going to happen through him to the rest of the nations. The second thing is just through like typology. We start to get characters whose lives start to point us towards Christ and who start to be a figure and a foreshadow of that, specifically with like the story of Isaac, right?
Oh, sure, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where now it's not just God telling people, hey, here's the things to come. He's not just giving little nuggets, but he's shaping people's entire lives to be an example of what this person is to be become. And he's putting them in situations that's going to start to show this thing that still has to come. So with Isaac, I think it was Deacon a couple weeks ago, right, talked about the story of Isaac in regards to worship. But Isaac becomes a foreshadow of Christ because Christ becomes the ultimate son who is there to be sacrificed for the benefit of the world. And Isaac himself, like he is, and at this point in the story, they're thinking like, this is the seed, right? This is the guy. This is the one who's going to come and crush the head of the serpent. Now you want to lay him down and be sacrificed, and like that's not going to work. We need, but we're going to trust God and we're going to go forward with this thing. And then ultimately, that just points us back to who it actually is going to be. Right.
And then there's a substitute in by the lamb with that whole story of Isaac.
Yeah.
And the knife comes down on the substitute rather than on Isaac. So there's a whole substitutionary message there as well.
Yeah. So not only is he the actual son, but he's also the substitute.
That's right.
Both in the same.
Right.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. There's a lot woven in on that story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we progress then through the Old Testament, as Abraham, this promise to Abraham starts to kind of come into fruition, right? He has the son has two more sons, and then the one son has 12 sons. And so this nation is starting to grow. We're seeing this blessing occur. We're watching it as this promise that God made to this man is being fulfilled, and his family is growing and growing and growing until they find themselves in Egypt. And things.
Well, there's a crisis, a famine hits.
Yeah.
Right. And then they have to go down to Egypt in order to survive. And what happens to them in Egypt? The very promise of this weak little nation that's only how many people went down there? 70 some?
Yeah, 70. I think it's 72.
72 people went down there. That's all there is. All there is this great nation that many descendants were promised Abraham, and they're barely hanging on
Mm-hmm.
for survival. And this is through the story of Joseph. Of course, they make it down to Egypt, and they're spared by the hair of their chinny chin chin, because God sent Joseph down there ahead of time. All these miracles that God does to preserve this nation. And while they're down there in enslavement, they multiply like crazy,
Mm-hmm.
but they're enslaved.
Yeah. Yeah, and Joseph himself is one of those people whose lives is like completely supposed to lead us towards Jesus. But yeah, we get to this point in the Exodus, and I think the Exodus is the Exodus event, the story of the Exodus is maybe our like kind of foundational story of what
Right.
it means and what it looks like for God to save. And that since that is the crux of the story and of the gospel, this becomes a super foundational and like formative story for how we're supposed to think of salvation.
Oh, well, yeah. And not only that, it was the crucial moment of salvation for the nation of Israel that they were commanded to always look back on
Mm-hmm.
in future generations. This was their gospel event.
Mm-hmm.
This is where God came to save in spite of them. And in the Psalms over and over again, they are to look back at that Exodus moment, that being delivered out of Egypt, being delivered out of slavery by the mighty power of God. They're to look back on, oh, this is how I know that God loves me
Mm-hmm.
and loves this nation, is because he did that.
Yeah.
And in the same sense, we're to look back too on our saving moment, which is the cross and the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. That's our saving moment. We're to look back on that event, whereas Israel looked back
Yeah.
on the Exodus.
Yeah, and then and similar, I think that there's so many tie-ins that we could bring into this, but there's nothing that the Israelites did to earn their salvation, for God to bring them out, to rescue them from the hand of
Right.
their oppressor, right? It was totally and completely based on a promise that he made generations before, and so he does that completely and sends the 10 plagues and pronounces judgment on Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods. As he's proclaiming his name, that becomes like a very big thing of why he's doing this. He's doing it to proclaim his name so that his name is known, and so the name of God becomes a very big thing within that story. And I also love how Moses ties into all of it. Because the story of Exodus is very interesting, and Moses himself is a Christ figure in the Old Testament. And so Exodus has a very interesting structure on how it works. So the first handful of chapters is all specifically about Moses, and we see him kind of doing this whole thing. So he's rescued as a baby through the waters, and then he has this testing period where he goes out into the wilderness, where that's where he encounters God, and then God eventually commissions him and sends him back to his people to rescue them. And then the story of the rest of the Israelite people follow that exact story, where God then rescues them, and he takes them through a testing period, and then he commissions them to go out and to be his representatives in the world. And so there's one figure that does it on behalf of the whole, and then pulls him along with him to go through the same process to become God's full people, which is exactly what Christ did for us, right? Like, that is the gospel. Jesus came, did it for us, and then pulls us along to come and do it with him.
Right. Yeah, that's good. And let's not forget the last plague, the killing of the firstborn.
Yeah.
And what did the Israelites have to do? They had to kill an animal and put blood over their doorstep, their arch of their door, in order for the destruction angel to pass over that place, because they saw it was covered with blood, the blood of a lamb. Again, foreshadowing Jesus. The destruction angel passes over them, hence the celebration of Passover, which the Israelites went ahead and celebrated as a major celebration in their history, always looking back again on how they were huddled in those dark rooms wondering if the destruction angel would. But by faith, they were told, just put blood over your doorstep. Well, how is blood over my door going to help save me from a destruction angel? By faith, they did. And the destruction angel passed over. And that Passover supper then is what Jesus gathered his disciples together on his Last Supper. And he transforms the meaning of the Passover supper into communion in the Last Supper, which the Passover supper was always pointing towards the person and work of Jesus.
Yeah. And so, this becomes just like the premier event of like what it means for salvation, and so it's the thing that they're constantly referring back to, constantly thinking back to. But yeah, so God saves them. He rescues them through the waters. He brings the waters back down on Pharaoh and his armies as they're chasing after him, and they finally find themselves sitting at the foot of Mount Sinai, and they're kind of like, "What do we do from here?" And so I think this kind of takes us into our next kind of nugget along the path of this progressive revelation, as now God has His people.
Right. There's a new nation.
There's a new nation.
Right.
They've been rescued out of slavery.
That's
and
right.
now He's going to send them out into the world. And how is He going to do that?
He sends Moses up onto the mountain and gets the law.
Yeah.
And Moses comes back with the law, and he comes back with not only the moral commandments and how to set up a nation under civil regulations, but he comes back with a whole way of, this is how you get right and stay right and come close to God through a sacrificial system. And the Israelites are point blank shown that sin requires atonement. There's no forgiveness unless there is the shedding of blood. And these animal sacrifices, which are being done on a regular basis, keep reminding the Israelites of their sin, but also keeps telling the Israelites, this is the way that you can trust me for the forgiveness of your sins, is through the blood of a substitutionary sacrifice, but needed to be done over and over and over again. And the most vivid one, part of the whole law, really, I think in some ways, was the Day of Atonement, that one special day where a lamb was sacrificed for the sins of all of Israel, and then a goat, they placed their hands on the goat. All the sins were symbolically placed on the goat, and the goat was sent out into the wilderness in this really visible way of, all your sins, Israel, are now cast away and out into the desert. This is how people were reconciled back to God. This was the gospel in a ritual form.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I find myself doing a lot recently is defending the book of Leviticus.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Who's criticizing Leviticus that you feel like you
Everybody.
have to?
Leviticus is
the
like
joke book,
is
right?
the joke book. Like, everyone's like, "Oh, you want to go to sleep? Read Leviticus." And I'm like, man, I love Leviticus. Like, Leviticus.
Oh, you're so weird.
Yeah, I know I am. But Leviticus is such an important book in the Bible, and one of the things that really kind of clarified for me the importance of Leviticus is not Leviticus. It's the last chapter of Exodus, and it's the first chapter of Numbers. And in those two chapters, we get a phrase that is almost verbatim the same thing, except for one minor tweak. At the end of Leviticus, we see the cloud come down, fill up the tabernacle, and then they can't enter the tabernacle. There's a problem. There's something that's stopping them from doing that, and that's where God's presence is. It's in the tabernacle. They're supposed to meet with God in there. And so the line at the very end of Exodus is God spoke to Moses outside the tent. From within the tent, and Moses is standing on the outside. And we pick up in Numbers, and it's almost the same phrase, except it says, and God spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting. He's in the tabernacle. So there's actually a story that's getting played out in Leviticus. Something changed between the end of Exodus and the beginning of Numbers that allowed Moses to enter into the presence of God. And so what is that thing that changed? here we have this big book of laws. And so what this whole book is about is how people are able, how sinful, flawed people are able to enter into the presence of God. And right at the center of that story, it's designed to kind of fold in on itself. It's called a chiasm. So the outside parts match, and then the inner parts match, and all kind of points into the center, where the center becomes the main point of the entire story. And so, what that story is right what you touched on. It's the Day of Atonement. And so that becomes the point, right? And so this whole book has been structured around how God is bringing his people in. And it's all based on not what they're doing, but this sacrifice that's going to be offered on their behalf that allows them to come into his presence. There's a price that needs to be paid. And so Leviticus is just all built around this idea, and it's at the center of the book, not just the book of Leviticus, but of the Torah as a whole. And it's so cool. It's so interesting, because it's not like we have to sit there and follow the law. Right? That's not the point of it. But Jesus did say that the entire law was built off of the commandment to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And every other commandment was built off of this. And so every single thing in there is how these people played that out in their lives, in their context. And so what that means looks different for us today, but it's all about that idea of bringing us into God's presence.
Yeah, as incomplete as it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it was incomplete in a sense. One high priest could only come into the Holy Holies once a year. The sacrifices needed to be done regularly, and there wasn't a complete, as Hebrews said, they couldn't have a conscience free from sin, because sacrifices were done. It was all pointing towards the most wonderful, complete sacrifices. Jesus, who it says in Hebrews, was done once for all, which is one of the most encouraging verses for me. His sacrifice was so great, only needed done once.
Yeah.
For all my sin and for all the sin of the world.
Yeah.
One sacrifice, once for all.
Yeah. And so when Jesus says, like, I did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, I came to fulfill it. Like, he came to be the fulfillment of this story, of every single thing that you read in there. So if you want a true, really full understanding of the person of Jesus, who he is, what his purpose was, you read the book of Leviticus, because that is all. The whole thing is about Jesus. Every single thing in there is about Jesus and what he did for you. And I think that's amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's a pretty interesting foreshadowing and teaching instrument in a pictorial, symbolic type of way to prepare the Israelites for a Messiah that was yet to come. And yet, with all that privilege, what happened as a nation?
They failed.
They slid.
Yeah.
Fell away from God. And then God started sending prophets to them. And yet God would not, even though Israel failed, God would not fail in his promises. And he kept sending the prophets, and the prophets began to give even a clearer picture of who this coming Messiah would be like. They definitely talked about a coming king. Isaiah 53 talks about this coming king would also be a suffering servant, which seems like in the time of Jesus, they didn't get that part of it, about the suffering servant. But Isaiah 53 is so clear about that. And in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, it points to how there's going to be a new covenant, that the old covenant that the Israelites were used to had its weaknesses, but God was going to bring a new covenant that would actually transform people's hearts. And then this whole gospel picture becomes a lot clearer as we move through the prophets.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's this whole progression as the Israelites come into the nation. They take over the land, and they kind of start getting their inheritance and stuff, and then eventually the kings are set up, the royal line of David is established, and God makes his promise to David of like, hey, I'm going to establish your throne forever, and your son is going to sit on the throne forever. And so that becomes kind of the seed of the promise that the prophets start to to speak about, right? Because everyone's now expecting this son of David to be the one who is the seed of Abraham, who is the seed of the woman, to be the one who's going to ultimately crush the head of the serpent. And as we go through the story of the Old Testament, following all these kings, right, each one fails and they're kind of getting worse. They're not really going in the right direction and things are going bad, and all of a sudden, like, there becomes this rift between the political leaders in Israel and those who have remained faithful to God, and that becomes the kings and the prophets, and they're kind of rivals against each other a little bit, because the prophets keep saying, "Hey, you're doing things wrong." And they're like, "Okay, we're going to kill you," and which is very different from kind of the time of Moses in Exodus, right, where he was the leader of Israel, but also the prophet of the time. And so when that split happens, there becomes just, things get worse and worse and worse, and the prophets are like, "Hey, this is not going the good direction. Destruction is going to come, but don't worry, there's still hope, because one will come out of this who is going to set us free. Like, we're going to go into exile. It's bad news. Like, Babylon's coming, destruction is coming, but eventually God will turn his face back towards us, and he will rescue us out of this." And so that becomes kind of the seed of hope for the people.
Right. And even the regathering of Israel back to the promised land, which is an incredible, miraculous thing, that God would preserve his nation, even a remnant.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that there has been an example in all of human history where a certain nation has been completely destroyed, assimilated into another culture, and then reemerging again, maintaining its own culture, its own language, as the Israelites did. I think they're the only example in all of history being able to maintain national identity and come back to reestablish itself in their homeland. That means that God is sovereignly being faithful with this nation, and that, yet even with that, God uses that regathering as a picture that there is going to be a new gathering up ahead, a new kingdom that he's going to gather someday. A new creation is going to dawn. A new temple is going to get established. And he's promising that a little bit with regathering of Israel, but he's looking at a big, broader promise of down the road when he culminates this entire history together, and there is a end of the story where God is completely victorious, where there's going to be a new Jerusalem coming out of the sky, where there's going to be Gentiles and Jews gathered. All that is being promised through the prophets, especially in regards to the regathering of Israel back to their homeland, promised land.
Yeah. And so that's kind of where everything leaves off.
Yeah.
We get to the end of the Old Testament, and whether you read the modern Christian Bibles, or you read the Tanakh, the kind of traditional Jewish ordering, both kind of leave off on this cliffhanger of like, so what happened next? Where is this guy?
400 years, we haven't heard anything.
Yeah, it's like it's very much an incomplete story, and it's meant to be an incomplete story. It's meant to be a story that builds anticipation for the one who's going to come and be the fulfillment of all of these little seeds and stuff that gets laid along the path. And so I love reading through the story with that in mind, because then you get to the New Testament and you're just like, yes, here he is, here's the guy. And so it becomes so much more rich and full as you go through the Gospels to see how Jesus starts to tie all these loose ends up, and how he becomes the resolution to all of this stuff. I think one of my favorite definitions of the Gospel is that the story of Jesus is the conclusion of the story of Israel. And I think that just, for me, that just helps to understand
that's good.
what's going on here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do you think we did a okay job explaining the
Yeah,
gospel?
I mean, we
in the
just
Old
talked through the
Testament?
entire Old Testament pretty much today.
Yeah, now you don't need to read it anymore.
No, read it. Go read it. Please go read it. It's my favorite.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah. So I think that's where we leave off, and so there's this message that needs to be proclaimed. There's this person that needs to come, and next week that's what we're going to talk about. Is we're going to talk about first the messenger who came to say, hey, it's coming, and then the person who was the fulfillment of that message and carried on that message, and then how he sent that message to be carried out by his followers to today.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. There we go.
So thank you for joining us on this episode of the Hometown Church podcast. It was a really fun conversation. Thank you for indulging me on this one and joining me on. I know we both kind of came into this like, I don't know how we're going to talk about this, but we decided to just kind of roll through and take that journey through the Old Testament and see how this all connects to the gospel, because I think it's so important for us to keep that in mind as we read. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Brent, for sharing your thoughts. We'll catch you next week. Have a good one.
See ya. Bye-bye.